embroidery machine on and let it calibrate, as it will always do when you first fire it up. And now we are ready to go in and bring up the designs. Put your USB stick into your machine. Now you want to grab your stylus, and I am using a super long stylus just because if I use my regular stylus, my fingers get in the way. So you want to go into your files and then pull up the USB stick. And we're just going to touch and hold that one or tap it twice. And then bring up the file with the owls in it. Now, this particular one is just going to be this one right here, which is my regular owls folder. And again, I'm either tapping it twice or touching and holding. And the owls will begin to populate. So this particular time, I am doing owl number 1. So all I need to do is touch and hold or touch twice. And up he comes on my screen. So cute. It tells you I need the 260 by 200 hoop or larger if you're just using the larger hoop, if you don't happen to have that one. And you'll notice right here, the design is centered into my hoop. So now we're ready to get going. Sorry, not centered into my hoop, centered into my stitch out frame. And now we're ready to go. So we will just push the go button. Then it'll prompt me that it wants the hoop. I'm going to clip in my hoop and off we go. Here's what you need to get started. First thing you need is a 200 by 260 hoop or larger. You need a piece of water-soluble stabilizer that is big enough for your hoop, and don't be too chintzy on your stabilizer. You don't have to cut it like massively too big, but make sure that it is big enough so that when we hoop it up, we have stabilizer sticking over the edges. You need your piece of background fabric, and you want to either mark on it like I have this. I've marked on this one my center with heat erasable marker just so that you'll be able to see it, but you can do that just with a crease. And I have pulled the fabrics that I'm going to use to make my owl as per the printout that comes with every single owl. So first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we hoop our fabric correctly. Let's take a look for a second at the anatomy of the hoop. You have the outer hoop, which generally has some kind of fastening clip at the bottom. You have the inner hoop that goes on the inside, and on that inner hoop, generally there is a size marked somewhere along it, whether it's at the top or the bottom, it depends on your manufacturer. And every hoop will have markings on the sides. Now these markings right here, they show the stitchable center of the hoop. And if you're looking at that, you'll say, well, that's not the actual center of the hoop, and it's not. It is the stitchable center of the hoop, and that's extremely important to get that concept wrapped around your head. So there's an area on this hoop right up here that is not stitchable. So when I'm looking at the center of my hoop actually center will be here and there. So there's an area here that's not stitchable. So it's really important that you notice the stitchable center of the hoop. And I have marked my stitchable center with some black just so that it might show up just a little bit better. And that is where we want to center our fabric. Now, some hoops will fit either way. I can put this in upside down and it still fits. So what you want to make sure is any hoop that you're using, if there is some wording on it, this one happens to have the manufacturer's name right there and it's got the size written on the bottom. You want to make sure that if I'm looking at the hoop, I have my hoop hookup over here that goes into the machine on the left. I have my clamping system on the right. And I can, when I put the hoop center in, I can read that it's not upside down. So that's important that you want to make sure that you have that taken care of. You also want to make sure that this isn't upside down. The clipping process will always be at the bottom, either in the center or on the right hand side, depending on which manufacturer you're using. Now that we've determined which way the hoop needs to go, we need to first, we're just going to hoop our stabilizer. Now with this particular project, I want to make sure that I also hoop my fabric. We're not going to be doing a float this time. So I usually will just kind of put my stabilizer on and then put my hoop in, and it sort of creases the stabilizer a little bit, so it might stay where it's supposed to stay. And then you want to grab your background fabric and you want to make sure that you are lined up with your hoop. Now I'm going to show you a little trick, because sometimes it's a little difficult to get this to work. So I'm perfectly lined up top to bottom, but obviously my center is out. So if I slide this down, I might unhoop my stabilizer, and then I'll put this in, and then this one becomes off. So let me show you what I do to make sure that I hoop okay. I'll get rid of this for just now. I like to use a product called Wonder Tape. Now, Wonder Tape is just a double-sided tape. It's just a little 1/4 inch wide, and I will go around the entire outside of my inner hoop. So I've turned it over. I'm now working on the underside of my inner hoop, and I just put a little piece of this tape all the way along, all the way around the outside, and when I pull off the paper backing, like so, it leaves just a little piece of the tape, just the sticky, that's a little sticky, on my hoop. So then what I can do is take my piece of background fabric and lay it down, and I can just take this hoop, this part of the hoop, and make sure that I am perfectly lined up side to side, top to bottom. Oops, got to move over just a little bit there. Like that. And if I just lay my inner hoop down, then when I pick it up, the whole kit and caboodle comes with me. I know that I'm perfectly lined up. And then all I have to do is lay my stabilizer around my outer hoop and just place it in. I don't have to fuss or fiddle. Okay, and you want to make sure that you're nice and tight. Now, when you're tightening up, if you have to really, really, really push on this clamp, you're way too tight. You need to back it off. You should be able to just close that with a little bit of pressure on your thumb and then tighten up with the screw. Now, you want the fabric to lay natural. You don't want to be pulling and pushing the fabric. We always used to do that, where we would hoop it up and then we would start pulling and pushing and tightening up the fabric. We don't want that to happen. What we want is the fabric to lay natural, because if we push and pull and tighten the fabric up so that it's so super tight like a drum, there's a good chance we're stretching it. And then when we finish embroidering on it, it looks lovely in the hoop. As soon as we take it out of the hoop, the fabric gets all wrinkly and it scrushes in. And that's because the fabric was so tight. We take it out of the hoop, it's now relaxed, and the stitching is on the really tight part. So what you want is the fabric to lay natural. The stabilizer, you want that to be nice and tight. And you also want to make sure that your hoop is on the bottom is all smooth. It's not sticking out like this so that you've got a bit there, or it isn't clipped in all the way so that the inner hoop is sticking up at all. So you make sure that that's done. And now we are actually ready to start stitching. So here I am at the sewing machine. I have my design loaded and I just need to click in my hoop. Now this first stitch out is going to be a lay down stitch that's going to show you where to put the batting, which is our next stitch out. So it doesn't really matter what color of thread you have in here. I'm going to use a black just so you can see what's going on. Normally I would put something, a beige or something white in here, but I just want you to see what's happening. So here we go. We'll stitch out the first stitch. There, so you can see this layout. Now I'm going to get the piece of batting and we're going to cover that up, but I am going to now switch my thread back over to a pale gray, because I don't want this color to be on top of my batting. So here I have my piece of batting. Now, if you are following along on the instructions, the batting tells you to cut the batting 9 by 11 inches. But you can just use your scraps and you don't have to be too horribly concerned about that, as long as your piece of batting is big enough to cover the entire layout of stitches that was just done. You don't have to get too fussy. It can't be shorter, but it can be bigger. So I have just like a lot of scraps of batting. So as long as I've covered my stitch line, I'm good. And if I am using a batting that has a definite scrim to it, I like to put the scrim down towards the owl so the fluffy is on the top. So once you put your padding in there, let her rip. You can see by the stitching that it's doing a much heavier stitch as it goes around there, and that is so that it will, when we cut this excess batting away, we're less likely to cut through our stitches. Now that that is done, you're going to take the hoop out of the machine, and probably your bobbin thread is still going to be connected, so cut your bobbin thread. And we are now going to trim away all this excess batting. Now this is where a really nice pair of small, sharp, right to the tip scissors comes in. And I like mine to have just a little bit of a curve on them so I can get right in there to those stitches. So I like to put this down on a flat surface so that I can just get right in there, get nice and close with my scissors. Get rid of all that excess. And if there's a little bit, like right here, I can go back and trim it tighter. So the first go around is generally fairly close, but a little bit rough. Yeah. And then I can go back and nip the parts that need to be a little bit closer. Just like that. And once I'm satisfied, there, once I'm satisfied, back to the sewing machine. There we are, all nicely trimmed. Now, if you are following along on the stitch out, or sorry, on the printout like you should be, it will tell you that we are on color number 3, and color number 3, it tells you to trim the fleece using the stitch down as a guide. Step 3 will secure the fleece in place. So this is going to now do a little kind of zigzag stitch all the way around. I will take a peek around here just to see if there's any fleece sticking out too much fleece sticking out that I could trim a little bit more, but we all look good. So stitch number 4 is the placement for the next piece. So I'm just going to go ahead and let that stitch. If you haven't already done so, you're going to want to put in a thread color that matches your next piece of fabric. And you're just going to go ahead and place the fabric over top of the placement lines that were just stitched out. And you just want to make sure that that whole entire placement line is covered. And go ahead and stitch. You'll notice that the piece of fabric is quite generous, and this is part of the beauty of doing applique. You don't have to worry about grain or anything on the fabric, so it's really good for scraps. If you have a scrap that is big enough, you can use it. You don't have to worry about having it pre-cut. And all I'm doing by smoothing this is just making sure that I don't have any wrinkles. The batting is a little bit grippy, so it kind of takes care of a lot of that for me, but I want to make sure that I don't have any pleats or wrinkles in the fabric. Now we are going to trim away all the excess fabric around the stitching that we just did. So when you are doing this outline part, you want to get nice and super close to those stitches and get rid of all the excess fabric. There is going to be a decorative stitch going over top of that, but you want to get rid of as much of it as you can without cutting into your stitches. And just trim all the way around. Now when you get to these stitches on the inside, you don't have to be quite as precise in here, because they are going to be covered up with other pieces of fabric, unless the fabric you're going to use is lighter than this fabric. In that case, you want to get right up to those stitches. If it's going to be a darker fabric, or you're not going to be able to see this fabric through your other fabric, you don't have to be quite as fussy. Close will count. So I'll just cut all that away, get rid of some of those extra threads, and we're going to do the same thing on this side over here. I'm going to cut away all that excess fabric. Now some of these pieces, when you cut them away, you might want to save them, because they will be big enough to use later on other pieces of the owls. And I'm just going to cut around here. There. All right. So now we're going to go back to, if you are following along, we are now going to do a zigzag stitch over top of here to tack down the fabric we just put down. So you're going to want to keep it in the same color that we used to tack it down. And then we are going to be doing some decorative stitching. So now we are ready to do stitch out number 7. Stitch number 7 is a zigzag to secure this fabric down. This next stitch, which is number 8, is a decorative stitch. So I have put a slightly different color of thread in my needle, and it's going to do some stitching on top of the wings. Color change number 9, I have switched back to my thread for this outside edge here, and we're going to do a decorative stitch along here and along here to tidy up that edge. And one of the really wonderful things is the decorative stitch that Anna uses, as opposed to just a regular satin, is more like a feather stitch, and it's just very pretty. And this is about a 2-minute stitch out. Number 10 is just a placement stitch for the next piece of fabric, so I'm just going to keep the same thread color in there. Just tell it to go. Now number 11 is the tack down stitch for the placement we just put down there. So you want to take your piece of fabric for the body, make sure that you have covered all the stitch areas, and don't be too chintzy. I don't like to get too close to my stitch line. It just makes it a little bit harder. And I'm kind of doing a little bit of fussy because this fabric is just so pretty, but I want some darkers on the edges. So I have changed to a thread that is a little more matchy. Got my piece of fabric down there, and this will be about a 2-minute stitch out. we go. Now, trim all of this excess fabric away. Okay. Oop. Now, once again, this line right here that's up against his face, you know that there's going to be another piece of fabric put in here. So you don't have to be as precise, again, assuming this fabric is not darker than the fabric you're going to put down. In my case, I believe it might show through a little bit, so I'm going to be as precise all the way around as I can. We want to get nice and close. And if you missed a little bit, just go on back and trim it down. There, I just missed that little bit right there. That is why you want super sharp scissors, right sharp, right straight to the tip. Okay, we have that trimmed off. Back to the sewing machine. Again, if you're following along, what we're going to do now is some decorative stitching on his belly. So we may change the thread color when we get there. So now we're on 12, and it is a decorative stitch, so you want to make sure you have matchy or contrasting thread to your tummy. Color number 13 is another lay down stitch for the next piece of fabric. So I'm just going to keep the same color of thread in there. Okay, we're now on color number 14, and it tells me I'm following along on my diagram so that I know what I need. We are working on the tack down stitch for piece number 3. So I'm just going to put my fabric in here. I have changed my thread back to a matchy color for my tack down stitch, and I am making sure, if I feel, that I have the entire area covered, and we're good to go. Go ahead and cut away all the excess fabric. Okay, we're going to trim this away. Now, I cut this one really close. I don't normally do that, but every once in a while you get this scrap of fabric that's just the perfect size. And then you just make sure it's going to fit in there. Okay, and we want to get all the way around and get off those little bits. Now something that's really important while I'm snipping these little guys off is to never ever take the fabric out of the hoop. You want to keep that fabric in the hoop, because on the embroidery machines can go back and you can redo things, you can restitch places that have been missed, you can go over a color with a different color if you don't like the color that you put on there. As long as you keep it in the hoop. Once you take the fabric out of the hoop, then it becomes a major chore to try to line everything back up again. Got a couple of little bits and pieces here. Okay, now this particular one, there's going to be other pieces that we're going to sew on top of this to get his pretty little face. Back to the sewing machine, because we're ready to stitch out. Oh, I missed a piece. There we go. Back to the sewing machine. We're ready to stitch out the next piece.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Delicious things to eat.
The popcorn can't be beat. The sparkling drinks are just dandy. The chocolate bars and the candy. So let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.